The ships came down through the clouds like metal gods descending from heaven. 12 vessels broke through Earth's atmosphere on a cold morning in October, and the world watched in terror as they spread across the sky like dark seeds scattered by an angry hand. In Geneva, the United Nations Emergency Council gathered within hours, their faces pale and their hands shaking as they read the transmission that had been sent to every government on Earth. The message was simple and cruel. Earth had been selected as the hunting ground for an ancient galactic tradition called the Apex Hunt, and humanity had been chosen as the prey. The transmission explained that once every 100 years, the 12 greatest predator species in the known galaxy sent their most elite hunters to a chosen world. And there they would compete to prove which species was the supreme predator. The rules were clear and terrible. The hunters would be released into a designated zone, and they would hunt until only one remained standing, and the primitive species of the chosen world could either hide and hope to survive, or send one champion to participate in the hunt as a gesture of respect. The aliens expected humanity to cower and hide. They had studied Earth from afar and seen a species with no claws, no venom, no natural armor, and no psychic abilities. And they had laughed at the weakness they observed. But they had made a mistake that would cost them everything. General Marcus Webb sat alone in a classified bunker beneath the Pentagon, staring at a file that officially did not exist, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The file contained information about a program called Spectre, a training initiative that had produced the deadliest human operatives in history. And at the top of the list was a single name that made even hardened military officials speak in whispers. Myra Vance. She was 34 years old, born in a small town in Montana, and she had been recruited into Spectre at the age of 19 after surviving an incident that the file described only as extraordinary circumstances. For 15 years, she had been a ghost, moving through the shadows of the world and hunting the worst predators humanity had ever produced. And her record was perfect in a way that seemed almost impossible. She had tracked human traffickers through the jungles of the Congo and eliminated them one by one over the course of 3 months. She had pursued war criminals across the frozen wastes of Siberia and brought them to justice when entire armies had failed. She had survived 18 months alone in territory so hostile that no extraction team could reach her, living off the land and completing her mission against all odds. When the Spectre program was shut down due to ethical concerns, Myra Vance had simply vanished into the wilderness, and no one had been able to find her since. But General Webb knew where she was. He had always known. A helicopter carried him to a remote mountain range in Alaska, where the air was thin and cold, and the silence was so deep it felt like a physical presence. He found her sitting on a rocky ridge, watching a herd of elk move through the valley below, and she did not turn around when he approached, even though he knew she had heard him coming from half a mile away. She was not what most people expected. She was of average height and average build, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes the color of winter storms. And there was nothing about her appearance that suggested she was anything other than an ordinary woman. But Webb had read her file, and he knew that her ordinariness was perhaps her greatest weapon. "They're not coming here to hunt animals," he said, standing beside her and looking down at the elk. "I know," she replied, her voice calm and quiet like a still pond. "They're coming to hunt us, and they think we're helpless prey." Myra finally turned to look at him, and Webb felt a chill run down his spine when he met her gaze. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that reminded him of the wolves he had seen in documentaries, patient and calculating and utterly without mercy. "Then they shouldn't have announced themselves," she said. Webb handed her a tablet containing all the information humanity had gathered about the 12 hunters, and she studied it in silence for several long minutes. The hunters were nightmares given flesh. There was Crixval of the Thornery, an 8-limbed monster with venomous spines and the ability to see in thermal and ultraviolet spectrums. There was Sovereign Malachar of the Velkesh, a psychic predator who could mark his prey's mind and track them across any distance. There was the Pale One of the Umbral Collective, a creature that existed partially in shadow and could strike from dimensions that other beings could not perceive. And there were 9 others, each one a legend among their kind, each one undefeated in centuries of hunting. "Will you do it?" Webb asked. "Will you represent Earth in the hunt?" Mira looked back at the elk in the valley, and a small smile crossed her face. "I'll need 14 days to prepare," she said, "and I won't be representing Earth as prey." She stood and began walking down the ridge toward the helicopter. "I'll be representing Earth as a hunter." The aliens found her entry into the competition amusing when they received the notification. The smallest and weakest species in the Conclave's records wished to pretend they were predators, and the 12 hunters laughed at the joke as they prepared for the hunt. On the night before the competition began, Sovereign Malachar reached out with his vast psychic powers to mark Myra's mind. Using the technique that had allowed him to track every prey across every terrain for 300 years. He expected to find fear or confusion, or perhaps the desperate courage of a creature that knew it was about to die. Instead, he found silence. Her mind was not empty, and it was not shielded by any technology he recognized. It was simply quiet, like the deep stillness of a forest in the moments before a predator strikes. For the first time in 3 centuries, Malachar felt something he did not recognize. It took him several minutes to understand that the unfamiliar sensation was hesitation. And somewhere in the mountains of North America, Myra Vance opened her eyes in the darkness and smiled because she had felt him looking, and now she knew exactly what his psychic touch felt like. The hunt would begin at dawn, but the question of who was the hunter and who was the prey had already begun to shift. The sun rose over the Rocky Mountains and painted the sky in shades of red and gold, and the hunt began. 12 hunters scattered across a zone that stretched for thousands of square miles. From the snow-capped peaks of the mountains to the endless grasslands of the Great Plains, and each one moved with the confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. The rules were simple and brutal. There would be no extraction and no surrender. Alliances were permitted, but in the end only one hunter could claim victory. The last one standing would bring glory to their species for the next 100 years. 11 hunters immediately began searching for advantageous positions, claiming high ground or finding defensive locations where they could watch for prey and competitors alike. Myra Vance did something different. She found a muddy creek bed in a shallow valley and lowered herself into the cold water and thick mud, coating every inch of her body until she was invisible to thermal scans and nearly impossible to detect with standard visual observation. And then she waited. For 6 hours she lay motionless in that creek bed, breathing slowly and watching the sky and the tree line, learning the patterns of her enemies as they moved through the territory. She watched a Thornery patrol pass within 20 meters of her position without detecting her presence. She observed the flight patterns of the Velkesh hunting drones that Malachar had deployed to search for prey. She noted the strange ripples in reality that marked the passage of the Pale One as it drifted through its shadow dimensions. She learned their habits and their blind spots and their schedules, and she stored every piece of information in her memory like a weapon waiting to be used. The first battle of the hunt happened in the late afternoon. Crixval of the Thornery encountered a massive Grandari warrior named Thok in a rocky canyon, and their fight was terrible to witness. Thok was a mountain of muscle and armored hide, standing nearly 3 meters tall with fists that could crush stone, and he had won 17 apex hunts across 5 centuries. But the Thornery were faster. Crixval moved like liquid death, his 8 limbs carrying him across the canyon walls as he dodged Thok's powerful strikes. and his venomous spines found their marks again and again until the Grendery fell. The massive warrior died slowly as the poison spread through his body, and Krixval stood over him and announced his kill across the shared communication frequency that all hunters monitored. "First blood to the Thornery," he declared with pride, and his voice echoed across the zone like a boast and a warning. Mira heard the announcement from her position in the creek bed, and she smiled beneath her mask of mud. Now she knew exactly where Krixval was. She emerged from the water after darkness fell and began to move through the wilderness with a patience that would have driven most hunters insane. She did not hurry. She did not take risks. She simply moved, silent and careful, covering ground at a pace that allowed her to observe everything around her while leaving almost no trace of her passage. It took her 2 days to reach Krixval's territory, and during that time she studied him from a distance. She watched his patrol patterns and noted that he followed the same route every 6 hours with only minor variations. She observed his rest cycles and discovered that he favored a particular rock formation that provided excellent cover from aerial observation. She noticed that his venom glands swelled slightly before combat, a subtle physiological tell that warned of an imminent attack. And most importantly, she realized that his 8 eyes created a processing delay when threats emerged from multiple directions at the same time. His sensory systems were incredible that they could be overwhelmed. On the third night, she put her plan into action. She had spent the previous day preparing, relocating Thok's corpse to a position upwind of Krixval's favorite resting spot and gathering materials for her traps. She had built a small device from scavenged electronics that could produce the specific sound frequency the Thornery used as a territorial warning. She had arranged a rock slide that could be triggered with a single pull of a cord. And she had covered herself in substances that would mask her scent and body heat from even the most sensitive detection. Krixval settled onto his rocky outcrop as the stars emerged overhead, his chromatophore skin blending perfectly with the stone until he was nearly invisible. He had no fear of the night. His species had never been ambushed in all their long history. They were the ambushers, not the ambushed. But Myra Vance was already there, hidden in a crevice less than 10 meters away, and she had been waiting for 3 hours with a patience that would have impressed even the most disciplined predator. She triggered everything at once. The rock slide crashed down to his left, sending dust and debris into the air. The scent of Grendery blood reached him from his right, carried on the wind from the relocated corpse. The territorial warning sound erupted from behind him, suggesting another Thornery had invaded his space. For 3 seconds, Krixval's incredible sensory systems were overwhelmed with contradictory data, and his 8 eyes flickered in different directions as his brain tried to process too many threats at once. 3 seconds was all Myra needed. She exploded from her hiding place with a speed that surprised even herself, driven by years of training and the cold focus of a predator who had found the perfect moment to strike. Her grandfather's knife, forged from high-carbon steel in a small workshop in Montana, found the precise gap between Krixval's primary nerve cluster and his venom sac. The Thornery died instantly, without understanding what had killed him. Myra stood over his body in the starlight, breathing hard but steady, and she felt no joy in the kill. There was only the satisfaction of a problem solved and a job completed. She took his hunting trophy, a ceremonial fang that marked him as an elite hunter of his kind, and she disappeared back into the darkness without making a sound. The communication channel buzzed with confused chatter as the other hunters tried to understand what had happened. A second competitor had fallen, but no one had announced the kill. No one had claimed victory. In orbit above Earth, the Conclave observers checked their instruments and found that Krixval was indeed dead. And they checked again because surely there had been some mistake. The human female could not have killed a Thornery hunter. It was impossible. But the readings did not lie, and for the first time in the long history of the apex hunt, the observers sent a warning to the remaining competitors. "Reassess the human," the message said. "Threat level unknown." Deep in the wilderness, Myra Vance cleaned her grandfather's knife and continued moving through the night. She had 11 more hunters to find, and now they knew that something was wrong. Now the real hunt could begin. The word spread among the remaining hunters like fire through dry grass. The thornery was dead. Crixval, who had never lost a hunt in 200 years, had been killed by the human female that everyone had dismissed as a joke. Some of the hunters refused to believe it at first. The Mordic warrior called Vex laughed when he heard the news and declared that the thornery must have been weak, that the great Crixval must have grown old and slow without anyone noticing. The human could not be a real threat. She was small and soft and had no natural weapons. She was prey, pretending to be a predator, nothing more. But others were not so certain. Sovereign Malachar sat alone in his camp and tried again to reach into Myra's mind with his psychic powers, seeking to mark her location so that he could track her movements. This time, she let him find her. She was sitting in a forest clearing several kilometers away, appearing to meditate in the morning light, and Malachar felt a surge of triumph as he locked onto her position. He sent the coordinates to Vex and to another hunter called the Crimson Eye, proposing an alliance to eliminate the human anomaly before she could cause more damage. The three hunters converged on the clearing from different directions, moving with speed and deadly purpose. They arrived to find nothing but a patch of disturbed earth where she had been sitting. And lying in the center of that patch was one of Malachar's own psionic tracking devices, removed from his equipment cache 30 kilometers away. It was still warm from her hands. Malachar stared at the device with growing horror as he understood what had happened. She had let him find her mind on purpose. She had wanted him to look, and while he was focused on the psychic connection between them, she had used that same connection to track his physical position through the resonance of his mental projection. She had been in his camp while he was hunting for her. She had been within arm's reach of him, and he had never known. The message was clear and terrifying. She knew where he slept. From that moment on, Malachar did not sleep at all. He moved constantly through the zone, never staying in one place for more than an hour, and his eyes grew dark with exhaustion while his hands began to shake. The hunt had changed. The hunters had become the hunted, and they did not know how to handle this reversal. Mira did not engage in direct combat unless it was necessary. She did not challenge her enemies to honorable duels or give them a fair chance to fight back. She studied each hunter carefully, identifying their biological limits and psychological weaknesses and cultural blind spots. And then she exploited those weaknesses with cold precision. The Velkash prided themselves on psychic dominance, so she targeted Malachar's sanity. She left traces of her presence in every camp he made, moving his possessions by centimeters so that he knew she had been there, but could never catch her. She took small items from his supplies and left them in places he would find later. She scratched marks into trees near his resting spots, marks that meant nothing but made him waste hours trying to decode them. Within days, the greatest psychic hunter in 3 galaxies was jumping at shadows and seeing threats in every rustle of leaves. The Kreth Dominion had sent an amphibious hunter named Draxel, who was unstoppable in water. His gills processed oxygen with perfect efficiency, and his webbed claws could tear through metal, and he had won 9 apex hunts by drowning his opponents in rivers and lakes. Myra did not try to fight him in the water. Instead, she spent 2 days collecting certain plants that were harmless to Earth life but toxic to Krethgill structures, and she poisoned every stream and pond in his territory. Draxel found himself unable to breathe in the water he depended on, forced onto unfamiliar dry land where he was slow and clumsy. She killed him on a muddy riverbank while he gasped for air. Vex the Mortek hunter was covered in natural armor so thick that most weapons could not penetrate it. But Mira noticed that he needed to open his armor plates to release body heat after intense physical activity, and she designed a trap that forced him to fight through a series of obstacles in the hot afternoon sun. By the time he reached the end of her obstacle course, his plates were wide open and his core temperature was dangerously high. Her knife found the gaps in his armor with surgical precision. The Crimson Eye was a sniper from a species that could see across vast distances and fire biological projectiles with perfect accuracy. Myra spent 3 days never moving in straight lines, never silhouetting herself against the sky, never staying visible for more than 2 seconds at a time. She exhausted him mentally, forcing him to track thousands of brief glimpses that never resolved into a clear shot, until his eyes ached and his concentration failed. Then, she approached from his blind spot and ended him quickly. One by one, the numbers fell. 8 hunters remained after the first week, then 6 after 10 days, then 4 as the hunt approached its final phase. The survivors began to communicate with each other, not as competitors anymore, but as prey trying to understand a predator they could not comprehend. How did she move without leaving traces? How did she predict their strategies before they even made them? How did she know their weaknesses better than they knew themselves? They did not understand because they could not understand. Every hunter species in the galaxy had specialized over millions of years, becoming perfect at one form of predation. The Thornery were perfect ambush predators. The Velkesh were perfect psychic trackers. The Umbral Collective were perfect shadow hunters. But humans had never specialized. Humans had become adequate at everything because their world had forced them to adapt or die. They had hunted mammoths with sticks and patience. They had survived ice ages by changing their behavior instead of waiting for their bodies to evolve. They had developed persistence predation, the ability to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, because they could not win in short bursts of speed or strength. Mira Vance was not stronger than her opponents, and she was not faster or tougher or more perceptive. She was simply relentless. She had turned the entire continent into her hunting ground, as she was closing in on the final survivors with the patient inevitability of a glacier grinding down a mountain. Only 3 hunters remained. Myra Vance of Earth, Sovereign Malachar of the Velkesh, and the Pale One of the Umbral Collective. The endgame had begun.
For 12 days it had drifted through its shadow dimensions, observing the hunt from angles that other beings could not perceive, and it had seen the human female systematically destroy the greatest hunters in the galaxy. It had watched her kill the Thornery with patience and precision. It had watched her drive Malachar to the edge of madness with psychological warfare. It had watched her adapt to every opponent, finding weaknesses that the hunters themselves did not know they possessed. In 500 years of existence, the Pale One had never encountered anything like her. The creature was ancient and terrible, a being of shadow and nightmare that had won more apex hunts than any other competitor in recorded history. It could phase between dimensions, stepping from the normal world into spaces that existed alongside reality, and it could strike from angles that should have been impossible. No prey had ever escaped it once it decided to hunt. No opponent had ever landed a blow on its translucent form. It was as close to a ghost as a living thing could be. But watching Mira Vance had filled the Pale One with something unfamiliar and unwelcome. It took the creature several days to recognize the sensation as fear. This human treated interdimensional physics as just another problem to solve. She had spent hours observing the Pale One's movements, noting the subtle ripples in reality that marked its passage through shadow space, tracking the patterns of its dimensional shifts like a scientist studying a natural phenomenon. She was not afraid of the Pale One. She was studying it. By day 12, only 3 hunters remained, and the Pale One decided that it could wait no longer. The human had to die before she learned too much. It would phase into her location while she slept, strike from a dimension she could not perceive, and end this anomaly before it could threaten the ancient order of the hunt. The Pale One found her in an abandoned mining complex high in the mountains. The rusted metal structures had been silent for decades, and the dark tunnels seemed like the perfect place for an ambush. She appeared to be sleeping in a small chamber deep within the complex, her body relaxed and her breathing slow and steady. The Pale One smiled. If a creature made of shadow could smile, this would be easy. It gathered its power and began to phase through the dimensional barrier, emerging from shadow space into the normal world right beside its unsuspecting prey. And then everything went wrong. The chamber exploded with light. High-intensity arc lights blazed to life from every direction, filling the space with blinding illumination that left no shadows anywhere. Mirrors and reflective surfaces that Mira had arranged in precise geometric patterns bounced the light back and forth, creating an overlapping web of brightness that penetrated every corner. The Pale One screamed as it felt the dimensional anchors it used to phase being disrupted by the uniform illumination. It tried to slip back into shadow space, but there were no shadows to slip into. For the first time in decades, the creature was forced fully into the normal world, solid and visible and vulnerable. Mira opened her eyes and rose from her sleeping position, and her expression was calm and focused as she faced the monster that had terrified 1,000 worlds. "You move through shadows," she said, her voice steady and clear in the echoing chamber. "I grew up reading about your kind in our physics journals, even though our scientists thought beings like you were only theoretical possibilities." She gestured to the mirrors and lights that surrounded them. "But I've been watching you fold space for 11 days now, and I understand the math." The Pale One tried to speak, but its voice came out as a rasping hiss. "You need specific light frequency gaps to phase between dimensions," Mira continued, moving slowly around the edge of the chamber. "You can't pass through a space that's illuminated uniformly from multiple angles, because your dimensional anchors need the contrast between light and shadow to function." She picked up a length of pipe from the floor and tested its weight in her hand. "We figured this out for something called quantum mechanics, the study of how very small particles behave in ways that seem impossible until you understand the rules." The Pale One lunged at her with a scream of rage and desperation. It was still fast, still deadly, still a predator that had killed thousands of opponents across centuries of hunting. Its claws raked through the air where Mira had been standing, but she had already moved, anticipating the attack with the reflexes of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting things that wanted to kill her. They fought in that chamber of blinding light, the ancient shadow creature and the human woman, and the battle was terrible and beautiful at the same time. The Pale One was stronger and had reach with its long arms, but in full visibility, on solid ground, it was fighting outside its element. It had never had to fight fair before. Mira was not stronger, but she was trained for exactly this kind of combat, close quarters against a larger opponent who was not used to resistance. She dodged and weaved and struck at vulnerable points, using the pipe to block the creature's claws and create openings for her knife. The Pale One screamed again as her blade found the thin membrane between its ribs. It stumbled back, dark fluid leaking from the wound, and for a moment its form flickered as it tried desperately to phase away from this nightmare. But there were no shadows, and there was no escape. Mira closed the distance and finished it with a single precise strike through its central nerve cluster. The Pale One collapsed to the ground, its translucent body becoming solid and still. Mira stood over it for a long moment, breathing hard but steady, and she felt something unexpected rise in her chest. "You were beautiful," she said quietly. "In the shadows, moving between worlds, You were something wonderful and terrifying, and I wish I could have seen you in your natural habitat instead of having to do this. She knelt beside the creature's body. I'm sorry it had to be this way. She took its dimensional resonator as a trophy, the device it used to anchor itself between worlds, and she turned off the lights one by one until darkness filled the chamber again. Then she walked out of the mining complex and into the cold mountain air. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the wilderness below, Sovereign Malachar was still running from shadows that existed only in his exhausted mind. One hunter remained. The hunt was almost over, and Mira Vance cleaned her grandfather's knife and began walking down the mountain toward her final opponent. In orbit, the conclave observers had stopped checking their instruments. They simply watched in silence as the impossible continued to happen. The human would face Malachar at dawn, and everyone watching knew, with growing certainty, that the outcome was no longer in doubt.
Sovereign Malachar stood in the tall grass of the Great Plains as the sun began to set. He had stopped running. He had stopped hiding. After 12 days of terror and exhaustion, after watching the greatest hunters in the galaxy fall one by one to a creature that should have been prey, the greatest psychic hunter in 3 galaxies had finally accepted what was happening. There was nowhere left to run. The human was coming, and he would face her with whatever dignity he had left. He was a pitiful sight compared to the proud warrior who had descended from the stars 2 weeks earlier. His elegant robes were torn and stained with mud. His eyes were bloodshot from days without sleep. His hands trembled with exhaustion, and his mind felt fragile and cracked from the constant psychological pressure she had applied. But he was still Valkesh. He was still a hunter who had won more apex hunts than any member of his species in recorded history. If he was going to die, he would die on his feet, facing his killer with open eyes. He watched her approach across the grassland, a small figure moving through the golden stalks with the easy grace of someone who belonged to this world. She carried no visible weapons except the knife at her belt. She wore no armor, no protective gear of any kind. She looked exactly like what the Conclave had labeled her at the beginning of the hunt, a soft and fragile creature with no natural advantages. But Malachar had learned the truth over the past 12 days. The truth was written in the deaths of 11 elite hunters. The truth was written in the fear that had taken root in his ancient heart. "You came," he said when she stopped 20 meters away. His voice was hoarse from days of talking to himself, trying to maintain his sanity against a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. "I expected you to hunt me in the night, to catch me sleeping or set another of your traps." Myra looked at him with calm gray eyes. "You stopped running," she said. That deserved respect. Malachar laughed, and the sound was bitter and tired. "I have never been prey," he told her. "In 400 years, across 900 hunts, I have never known what it felt like to be the one who runs and hides." He shook his head slowly. "I understand now, human. I understand what you are." Mira said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "Your species," Malachar said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "You are not apex predators, not in the way we understand the term, and that is why we underestimated you so completely." He spread his arms to indicate the vast grassland around them. "You are something worse than apex predators. You are generalists, creatures that adapt to any environment and any challenge." His eyes met hers. "You take what we are and find its counter. You study our strengths and transform them into weaknesses. You are not the top of a food chain, but the chain itself, reshaping around whatever enters it." Myra nodded slowly. "We are survivors," she said. "That is all we have ever been, a species that learned to survive because our world gave us no other choice. Our ancestors faced ice ages that lasted thousands of years, and they adapted their behavior and their tools instead of waiting for their bodies to change. They hunted animals 10 times their size, by following them for days until the animals collapsed from exhaustion, because humans could sweat and cool themselves while running, but their prey could not. They faced predators with claws and fangs and venom, and they made weapons and traps and strategies to overcome those natural advantages. She took a step forward. Every hunting species in the galaxy specialized because specialization is efficient, but humans generalized because generalization is flexible. You became the perfect psychic predator, the perfect ambush predator, the perfect shadow hunter, but perfection is fragile. Perfection is fragile. When something challenges your specialization, you have no backup plan. Malachar nodded slowly, understanding at last. And you have nothing but backup plans, he said. That is your advantage. You are adequate at everything, and you use tools and patience and adaptation to close whatever gap remains. Myra nodded. Malachar straightened his torn robes and gathered his remaining strength. His psychic abilities coiled around him, not as weapons now, but as shields, a final expression of pride and defiance. I will not flee, he said. I will not beg for mercy or offer surrender. But I ask one thing of you, human. I ask that you remember that I faced you at the end. Remember that I did not look away. Myra's expression softened slightly. I will remember, she promised. You have my word. The duel was brief, but intense. Malachar hurled his psychic attacks at her with all the power he could summon, blasts of mental energy that would have shattered the mind of any unprepared opponent. But Myra's mind was not unprepared. She had learned to quiet her thoughts since childhood, to become a calm surface that reflected rather than absorbed. His power slid off her like water off stone, and her knife did not miss. Malachar fell to his knees as she withdrew the blade, and he looked up at the sunset with eyes that were finally at peace. Well fought, he whispered. Hunter! Then he was gone, and Mira Vance stood alone in the tall grass as the last light faded from the sky. The hunt was over. 3 days later, the conclave of hunters received a transmission from Earth. A single human woman stood before the camera, 12 hunting trophies arranged on a table behind her, and her eyes were tired but absolutely steady as she spoke. My name is Mira Vance, she said. I speak for Earth. Your hunt is concluded. She paused and looked directly into the lens. We are not prey, she continued. We have never been prey. We are what happens when a species spends 200,000 years learning to survive everything our world could throw at us. Ice ages and predators and plagues and each other. We do not have claws or venom or psychic powers. We have patience, we have adaptability. We have the ability to look at any problem and any enemy and any hunt and find a way. She stepped closer to the camera. Take this message back to your conclave, she said. Take it to every species that thought Earth was a hunting ground. We are not asking for war, and we are not threatening conquest. We are simply telling you what we are. Her voice grew stronger. We are the species that refuses to be hunted. Come in peace, and you will find welcome. Come as predators. She smiled, and in that smile was every human who had ever faced extinction and said not today. And you will find me. The transmission ended. And across the galaxy, 1,000 species watched the recording and felt something they had never felt when looking at humans before. They felt respect. And more than a few of them felt fear. Earth was no longer unknown. Earth was no longer prey. Earth had sent one woman against the greatest hunters in the galaxy. And she had pursued them all.